guest this week on Veterans Chronicles is Stephen Fenves. He is a survivor of the Holocaust and a United States Army veteran. Sir, thank you very much for being with us.
Thank you for having me.
Where were you born?
I was born in what was then Yugoslavia. It's now Serbia. But 12 years before my birth, it was still Hungary. That's why I was brought up in Hungarian speaking, even though I went to Serbian schools. My family was Jewish. I don't know when they migrated to Hungary. Hungary opened up in the 17th century and gave full emancipation to Jews in 1863. On my mother's side, my grandfather was a lawyer. On my father's side, my grandfather was first a tanner, then a lumber dealer, and they moved to Subotica after that.
You were born in 1931.
Right.
And it was 1941 that all of the trouble began. What was your childhood like before the Hungarians came?
Very comfortable, very upper class upbringing, and important for the story later, a German governess for my sister and me from age 3, because that was expected in that social setting. But public school, 5.5 days a week, Hebrew religious education, three afternoons after school, and a youth service Saturday afternoon, since we missed the regular Saturday morning service.
Do you remember any conversation in your house after World War II started in 1939, being concerned about what was happening? Was it a common topic?
By that time, my father was editor-in-chief of the newspaper that his brother had started. So, yeah, everything revolved around the paper and the news, and there was a lot of discussion of what was going on. I particularly remember the 1942 massacre in a town about 100 kilometers south. And as an 11-year-old, I remember trying to imagine what a mass death may be.
So April 6th, 1941, is when Hungarian troops came into your town.
Yes.
Explain what happened that day.
On the very first day, an officer with drawn firearm expelled my father from his office. The paper was confiscated and turned over to an Aryan manager. We lived for 3.5 years. Half of our apartment, the other half was requisitioned for military. Increasingly severe, punitive, degrading regulations at all time, including the law that Hungary started long before Germany, restricting Jewish attendance in academic schools to 6%, and academic school start in 5th grade. So I had to take that grueling exam, and I was one of the 9 who were accepted, but it really didn't matter because you sat in the back row. Teachers never recognized if you raised your hand, so a sort of wasted education. Wasted time, not education.
What was it like sharing your home with the people who were oppressing you?
Well, that we lucked out because, I know that's a unique situation, but the 3 officers who occupied what used to be the children's room and my mother's studio were all one prince and 2 counts who had this housing outside the barracks because of their rank, and they tried to speak French to my mother, and she decided she was not going to be the gracious hostess with these people. But on that we lucked out.
Did you interact with them much?
Yes. Hungarian officers always click their heels, and I was clicking my heels, and my mother severely reprimanded me for for copying what the officers did.
Were you allowed to interact with your friends?
Yes. Yeah, I mean, that's all we had, is the group of us who were together in school and in the religious school afterwards. Yeah, friendship was a very important part.
March of 1944, Germany takes over
Yes.
the area.
Yes.
And then your father was sent away.
My father was sent away. All the intelligentsia, lawyers, doctors, newspaper people, etc., were rounded up the first week.
And then he was sent to Auschwitz first, correct?
We didn't. We knew that he was in a camp just south of the town, and then he disappeared off the horizon. It turned out he was taken to Auschwitz, was shipped from Auschwitz to a coal mine in Silesia. None of us ever expected him to return. He had angina before the war, and miraculously after the war he returned on a Soviet hospital train, totally broken in body and spirit. It lasted 4 months, and then he passed away.
What were you thinking when the Germans came in?
I was working in a machine shop of a former employee of my father's. Even after we were sent in the first ghetto, which was on the edge of town, and I was very happy that I could do that and earn some money. Also, I had a pass, so I could get out of the ghetto, and my 13th birthday was June 6, 1944. And this shop, there were all Serbs working there, had a clandestine radio, and we heard the announcement of the Normandy invasion. And I believe, I can't confirm it, but I believe that I was the first one who brought the word into the ghetto after my shift was over, to let people know that had happened.
So outside of the clandestine radio, there wasn't much knowledge of what was happening in the war?
No, absolutely not.
And what was the newspaper like after they took it over from your father? Just propaganda?
First, propaganda to the point where the actual deportations in June, I saw the newspaper, a copy of the newspaper later. That was the front page news about the deportations and about the Hungarian gendarmerie colonel explaining who can get shot for what. There was no German in sight. I mean, you have to remember, 120 Germans deported 400,000 Jews. It's only worked because the Hungarian gendarmerie had a complete statewide plan made up a long time ago on how they were going to do that, and the Germans just let them do it.
What was it like for you when they started to move you and the rest of your family?
My concern was mostly for my mother. She was very upset. She was very panicky, and that was my job, to try to be of help to her and calm her. And go when we were several times she sent me to her mother, to my grandmother, when she couldn't go, and then at the end when we were moved to the ghetto, I alone went to my grandmother and helped her move in with us.
Did you know at that time what was happening in these camps?
Not explicitly. There were rumors, there were stories, but they were so unbelievable that nobody believed it. No. But about specifically where and what Auschwitz was, no, we had no information whatsoever.
So where did they moved you to a temporary camp before they sent you to Auschwitz, correct?
Right.
What was that like?
Well, our housing was a former chicken coop. It was a village, that was emptied of its inhabitants to be converted to this concentration camp where people from the various towns of the region would be brought in. Horrible circumstances, no sanitation facilities, no water, no medical facilities, and just mayhem. I just remember as kids were running around all day because there was nothing else to do.
We're speaking with Stephen Fenves. He's a survivor of the Holocaust at the Auschwitz camp, as well as Buchenwald, as we'll get to later. He's also a veteran of the U.S. Army, and we'll continue his story here on Veterans Chronicles in just a moment. We're back on Veterans Chronicles. I'm Greg Columbus, honored to be joined today by Stephen Fenves, a survivor of the Holocaust and a U.S. Army veteran. And, sir, we were just talking about your early years and, of course, how your family was completely uprooted by first the Hungarian forces and then the Germans coming in. And when we left off, you were kind of in a transition camp being prepared to be sent ultimately to Auschwitz. The train ride, I've heard, was absolutely horrific.
When I say 80 people to a boxcar, American audiences visualize a long American boxcar with four axles, four bogies. These were European boxcars, just two axles, and very, very small in size, and 80 people crammed into that. No food, nothing, no sanitation facility except a barrel that overflowed after the first hour, and that was it. And that was, I believe my memory is correct, that was 5 days and 5 nights in there. People going mad, people dying, which was a plus because they could be stockpiled in the corner, and there was a little more room to sit down. Not much more than that.
How would you describe how much space you had? Are you like this, or do you have...
You could sit in a crouch position.
Did people talk much?
Yes, crying, wondering where we're going. Some optimists describing the work that we were going to do, etc. But yeah, but long silences and just sobbing.
Were there any soldiers in the car with you?
Nope. The cars were sealed from the outside.
Did it stop? Did it make stops?
Nope. I mean, stops, yes.
But you weren't let out?
We were not let out, yeah. Long stops.
Describe the arrival.
Arrival, doors bang open. Your listeners who have seen Schindler's List may remember the scene where the children get off their train in Auschwitz, a nicely sloping ramp where they could walk down at leisure. There was no such thing. It's just a waist-high or higher railroad cars, and if you didn't jump, you were thrown out. Inmates, SS, dogs, all at you, tossing you out, telling you to leave everything behind, and lining up, women on one side, men on the other side. Leaving behind included my maternal grandmother who had a prosthetic leg, and she was just sitting on a bunch of suitcases, and we never saw her since. My mother and sister going one way and I going the other way. A German SS officer waving people right and left. That day I didn't know what right or left meant. That night people explained to me that one road was to the gas chamber and the other one was to the camp. So somehow at age 13 I was sent that way. Waved to my mother and sister. That's the last time I've seen my mother. She perished in a couple of weeks. Long lines, stripped of all clothes, shorn of all hair, handed some broken down shoes and some tattered clothes, marched double time into one of the compounds, and then those of us kids of my age were tossed into this barrack, which had about 1,000 kids my age. The first thing that I remember and the first thing I recall is the stench of the fumes coming from the crematorium, stench of your own clothing and body, your excrement sticking to you because there was no way to clean it, clothing not changed for 6 months and shower maybe once every few months. That sticks to me more than the hunger and thirst. Food doled out twice a day, watery soup, until you accumulated enough black market credits to get a cup. The soup was ladled in your hands.
In your hands?
Yes. Kids next around me were dying right and left. In Auschwitz, you saw everywhere these walking corpses, shuffling along, hazed eyes looking out to seeing nothing. People whose soul has long ago departed them, and eventually carted out some morning with the dead of the night, tossed into the crematorium, alive but really not alive, but already dead. So it was a very trying time. Auschwitz, in addition to being a death camp, was also a huge meat market, stockyard, where prisoners were stockpiled to be selected by German workers to work in railroads, mines, factories, etc. These foremen came and selected their workers. For obvious reasons, they never stopped in a barrack with 1,000 kids, 14, 15 age at most. So these people were dying faster than my classmates were dying away. What saved me is this miserable governess that I had before the war. Because I spoke fluent German, the trustees, the inmates who controlled the camp, were German criminals brought in by the Nazis to lord over the other inmates, and they picked me as an interpreter. So I got this great reward of being allowed to scoop out the bottom of the barrels in which food was served with my spoon. So that was Auschwitz. What saved me is in the middle of the summer, the German criminal overseers were replaced by Polish politicals. And one of them came over looking for an interpreter who spoke German, Hungarian, and Polish. I'd never heard Polish spoken in my life, but figured out that Polish and Serbian must be similar, and I volunteered. You learn to volunteer in circumstances like this. If the Germans are looking for carpenters, hundreds of hands go up telling that they're experienced carpenters. So I became an interpreter to the Polish inmates, and they were all part of doing whatever resistance they could, and expected everybody working with them, working for them, to do the same thing. So that gave me a lift on life that I didn't have before, and that's what carried me through the rest.
Sir, let's pause just a moment. We'll come back with the rest of your amazing story on Veterans Chronicles. Welcome back to Veterans Chronicles. I'm Greg Corombos, honored to be joined today by Stephen Fenves, Holocaust survivor and veteran of the U.S. Army. In the past segment, he was expressing his incredibly gripping account of life inside the Auschwitz camp, and the death that was all around, and the circumstances that ultimately combined to save him. We left off with you as an interpreter for the Polish forces that were administering the camp at that point.
Forces is a too strong a word. Among multiple thousands of inmates in one compound, there were 20 inmates in charge of the individual barracks, and those were the kapos, and those were Polish.
How did the other inmates look at you as you interpreted between them and those who were in charge?
Well, I quickly learned that it's not a question of literal interpretation. If the German foreman asked whether they were expert at working on a lathe, but I translated it. He wants to know that whether you can work on a lathe. If you have any skill similar to that, say yes. And then I reported that so many people said yes. So it was a lot of manufactured words rather than literal translation. And I think the others appreciated that. In addition to that, these were very enterprising young people. We organized the roof repair detail. If you have been at the Holocaust Museum, there's a nicely dressed up barrack out of Auschwitz. They were derelict and roofs were leaking, and this was late fall of 1944. So the SS accepted that some repair needed to be made. So this group was formed, and we went from compound to compound repairing roofs, pretending to repair roofs. Women's compounds were very often there because the Polish kapos' girlfriends were female kapos in women's compounds. So through that extraordinary circumstance, I met my sister in the camp, which didn't occur very often, and even managed to convert some of my black market goods to get her a scarf and a sweater before she was sent out on an outgoing transfer. So that was, those were interesting days. Black marketing everywhere. The unit of currency was the gold watch. Plenty of them were available from these compounds called Canada, where the goods taken off the arriving inmates were sorted and stored. And we could always replenish our currency there. And so I got to see a lot of Auschwitz that way. As fall approached, things were getting tougher. More severe selections directly to the gas chambers. The Polish kapos decided to smuggle me out on looking for a safe transport. It was known that sometimes they went through the whole procedure of loading up a train to go somewhere. Train turned around and was brought back, and everybody was shipped to the gas chamber. So I wound up in a very small camp, a satellite of Buchenwald, owned by Messerschmitt, manufacturing Focke-Wulf wings of Focke-Wulf fighter planes. 16-hour-a-day work days, 6.5 days a week. German foremen and all the critical positions, but all of the riveting, etc., done by inmates. Food and lodging was considerably better than Auschwitz. Only 3 or 4 people to a bunk rather than 7 or 8 or 9. A table and benches to sit to eat. A very imaginative cook, a former chef in Prague, who managed to create some variety and taste. Absolutely fantastic evening life. Everybody was doing something. Cobblers, tailors, fixing clothes with needle and thread, obtained from the civilians and civilian workers on the black market, making weapons out of anything that we could liberate out of the factory, even though everything was punishable by death. there were about 6 or 7 kids my age. Some of the older inmates decided that in the midst of this uproar that our education should not be interrupted, so they, after 16-hour workday, they sat us down for lessons in French and algebra and geography.
Wow.
I can't tell I learned much of that, but that's how. I mean, that was really a absolutely amazing and gratifying experience in my life to see how people could retain so much humanity in such tight circumstances. Auschwitz was different. There you were cut down to a non-entity. You had no right to expect any kind of intellectual or artisanal or any other kind of activity, but just raising the alimentation, the food level from less than 1,000 calories to something like 1,200 calories. Everybody was deeply involved.
The classes you mentioned, was that done secretly or?
At night, we had the camp, which was actually a converted factory with partitions. There was a large partition area which was called the Commons, and they just, over the noise of cobblers and jewelers and everything, in one corner they sat us down and gave our classes. And the religious Jews had their own activities. Sometimes you had to yell them after lights out because there were still debates about the Bible passage for the forthcoming Sabbath, and you finally had to yell at them to stop it, and so we could get some sleep. They made a Hanukkah ceremony with oil lamp, machine oil with I don't know what the wick was of. They made Passover ceremony with a small piece of matzah, unleavened bread obtained from a German worker, baked over a light bulb. That's how the people worked. So that lasted till factory was slowing down. We were not bombed, but the intervening railroad was bombed, so that production was sort of grinding down to nothing. On the 1st of April, they marched us out. It took us 10 days to reach Buchenwald. Estimate that half of the people who started didn't make it to the end, shot for falling behind, escaped, some of them successful, some of them shot after being caught. So we arrived in Buchenwald on the night of the 10th and put in a barrack somewhere. And all I remember is the next day somebody shook me awake and told me that the Americans were there, and we ran up to the barbed wire, and we saw the tanks and trucks and jeeps of the 5th Armored Division going by.
What were you feeling in that moment?
I can't answer. I can recite facts, but I can't. I didn't have time for feelings. I didn't have time to remember feelings. All I know is that I collapsed and I woke up sometime later, I don't know how many days later, in a field hospital. Buchenwald was on one side of a hill. The other side of the hill was a huge rest and recuperation facility for the SS, and the Americans cleared all of that out, and the 160th Field Evacuation Division created a hospital out of that, and that's where I was taken, and they started me on feeding me intravenously, and then slowly I recuperated there. Just to tell you what the Americans thought of the situation, this was a field evacuation hospital that started in Normandy. When they got to Buchenwald, the nurses were all sent out to TDY elsewhere because the command thought that the position was too onerous for them to face. And they rehired the German nurses that had worked for the SS before. So that's how I got out.
That's April of 1945.
Yes.
And when were you free to go home?
The Iron Curtain was down. The name was not there yet, but French, Belgian, Dutch, Danish, etc. prisoners were gone in 48 hours. Those of us who wanted to go east to Soviet-occupied territories were there for months. I think I got back in July.
Okay. And then your sister was back there as well, correct?
My sister came a few weeks later, and as I said, to everybody's surprise, local firemen carried my father from the railroad station to my aunt's apartment where we all congregated, and that was the family that was left.
And your father passed away shortly thereafter.
But at least we could give him a burial in the tomb that where his brother had been buried.
Now, as you mentioned, it was Soviet-occupied territory, so it wasn't long before that repression started to impact you.
Oh, that was immediate. It wasn't Soviet-occupied territory. The partisans, the Soviets made one big mistake in Yugoslavia, is they never instructed their troops that this was not occupied territory, but it was a ally that had liberated itself. And I escaped in 1947. Tito broke with the Soviet term a few months later, but even at my age, it was clear that the people who spent the previous 4 years in the hills as partisans fighting the Germans were going to go back there, and Tito had the choice of either going with them or not going with them. So that was pretty much preordained.
So for the second time, you're only 16 years old at this point,
Yeah.
right? You're being essentially forced to leave home again.
Yep.
How did you decide to come to the U.S.?
My maternal uncle emigrated sometimes in the 20s, I think. And after the war, my father made contact, and my uncle could send affidavits to us, my sister and me, not to my father, whose hometown remained in Hungary. And that was one of the things that really bothered my father till his death, that we might be separated again. Of course, we would have never left him there. So we eventually got in on the regular quota. The Yugoslav, my sister and I both lost our displaced person status because we were repatriated.
Mm-hmm.
The Yugoslav quota had not been used since 1941, and so eventually it was reopened in 1950, and I have certificate number 147.
So you came to the United States, and soon after you decided to join the Army.
I did not.
You were drafted?
I was welcomed by a lot of people, many people who knew my parents. But the warmest welcome was from the local Selective Service Board. 19-year-olds, healthy, no college deferment, no family difficulties. So in less than 15 months after I came, I was in the Army. And 4 months later, after basic training, I was back in Europe, back in Germany.
And what was your assignment? What was your responsibility?
Well, I was sent to an intelligence battalion because I had passed 4 interpreter MOS tests. After some time, they decided that since I was not a citizen, since I still had relatives behind the Iron Curtain, they couldn't clear me. Very fortunately, a friendly officer informed me of this information and said, "Soldier, normal procedure is to send you back to infantry. You look a little bit more intelligent than that. What else can you do?" And I said, "Sir, I was studying to be a civil engineer. I worked as a draftsman in a civil engineering office. I passed the MOS for draftsman." And he called across to engineer section 7 at 7th Army headquarters in Stuttgart, and for the following year and a half I was draftsman and then chief draftsman in that section.
Okay. And then
And then I got rotated out early so I could start school full-time in February 53 on the GI Bill.
And then you studied computer science, correct?
I studied civil engineering, but most of my work was early days of application of computers to engineering. GI Bill paid my education through the PhD, through the master's. There was a state program that paid my tuition for PhD. We got married in '55. First house was with the GI Bill, on a GI Bill, so I got a good deal out of the U.S. Army.
Very good, sir. We'll take one more break and come right back with Stephen Fenves on Veterans Chronicles. We're back for our final segment in this edition of Veterans Chronicles. I'm Greg Columbus, honored to be joined by Stephen Fenves, U.S. Army veteran and survivor of the Holocaust. And, sir, your account of your time at Auschwitz and at the satellite camp of Buchenwald is so gripping and so heartrending. When you think back now more than 70 years, and I'm sure it's hard to believe it's been more than 70 years in some ways, what do you want people to know? What do you want them to take away from your story?
That this atrocity of 6 million people exterminated, only crime being that they were Jewish, to remember that happened, and to be concerned to make sure that it doesn't happen again. We've had many genocides since. None of them rose to the level that one associates with the Holocaust. Sadly, 2 of them in my own native country, in Bosnia and Kosovo, shows that evil can arise everywhere, that populations can be enticed, excited to murderous things, while the majority, the silent majority, stands by. And I, as a survivor, as a witness, I think it's my responsibility to advertise this fact, if people don't realize it exists, to make sure that they look around them, make sure that prejudice, hatred doesn't escalate to the point where eventually it becomes a government policy, not just the beliefs of the fringe, and eventually, in the name of that country, in the name of that people, genocides and worse occur. I owe this to my parents, to my buddies who perished, to 6 million others who perished, to do whatever I can, such as the interview with you, to make people aware what has happened and how easy it was for a small group of dedicated ideologues to get the most advanced, the most intellectually and economically advanced country in Europe to descend to this level of bestiality, which I still can't fathom. It's still a puzzle to me how this could have happened. And the only thing I can think of, and the only, not justification, but the only explanation that makes sense to me is that there was this enormous silent majority that just went along, and since it didn't affect them, they didn't care whether it affected somebody else.
As you know, there are some, and it's considered a fringe, but there are some who simply don't believe that the Holocaust ever happened. Are you concerned about that, and are you especially concerned, a few decades from now, when there won't be survivors to tell the story about their own personal experience?
I'm very concerned. I have no idea how I or anybody else could shake this thing that you call belief. I don't think it's really a belief. It's an ideological conviction that they have the truth, and there's no amount of fact. It has been tried many times. There was the Lipstadt trial in England, where the best known, most active denier in Great Britain lost the case from a demonstration that everything he falsified and everything that he misstated. People like that will arise. Professors at universities. There's one professor at Northwestern who still openly in class presents his quote-unquote revisionist views. Only response is that teaches a required course in electrical engineering. University's response is, but students can go in another section, putting the burden on his, as a university professor of 42 years, I can see that other people are not that crazy about picking up the extra load. But anyhow, a very small number of ideologues can, in the right economic circumstances and the right political support and the right military support and the right judicial support, can make that escalate. And whether these people continue mouthing what they mouth, that's not important. What's important is whether branches of the government begin to follow them.
Sir, it's an amazing story. We thank you so much for sharing it. I know it's not easy, but I know how important you believe it is to share, as you've expressed, and we certainly agree with that. Thank you very much for your time today. We appreciate it.
Thank you.
Stephen Fenves, Holocaust survivor and U.S. Army veteran, is our guest this week and has been our guest this week on Veterans Chronicles. Hi, this is Greg Corombos, and thanks for listening to Veterans Chronicles, a presentation of the American Veterans Center. For more information, please visit AmericanVeteransCenter.org. You can also follow the American Veterans Center on Facebook, and on Twitter, we're at AVC Update. Subscribe to the American Veterans Center YouTube channel for full oral histories and special features, and of course, please subscribe to the Veterans Chronicles podcast wherever you get your podcasts. Thanks again for listening, and please join us next time for Veterans Chronicles.